Welcome to Whole Bible Study. I'm your host, Tad Inoue. Today we've arrived at one of the most difficult chapters in the entire book of Numbers. If you've ever read Numbers chapter 25 and found yourself wondering why God's response seems so severe, you're not alone. This chapter contains one of the harshest judgments we've encountered so far. Thousands of Israelites died during a plague. Moses commands the leaders to deal decisively with those who have joined themselves to another god. Then, in one of the most startling moments in Torah, a priest named Phinehas kills an Israelite man and a Midianite woman with a spear, and the biblical author presents his actions as faithful rather than sinful. For many modern readers, this chapter feels deeply unsettling. It raises honest questions about violence, justice, covenant, and the character of God. Rather than avoiding those questions, I'd like us to explore them together. Our goal today isn't simply to decide whether we agree with everything that happens in this chapter. I think there's a more important question we need to answer first. Why would the ancient Israelites have viewed these events as such a profound threat? Before we evaluate the story through modern eyes, let's understand it through theirs. If we can step into their world for a little while, I think we can begin to understand why the biblical author tells this story with such urgency. That doesn't mean every difficult question disappears, but it does mean we'll be reading this chapter within the historical and cultural world that produced it instead of expecting it to think like we do. To understand Numbers 25, we first need to remember where we are in the larger story, because this chapter doesn't appear in isolation. It represents the climax of a series of events that have been unfolding through Israel's journey in the wilderness. 40 years have passed since the Israelites left Egypt. The generation that witnessed the Exodus has almost entirely disappeared. Those who refused to trust God at Kadesh Barnea and enter the Promised Land have died in the wilderness, just as the narrative said they would. Now their children stand where their parents once stood. Israel is camped on the plains of Moab, just east of the Jordan River. Across the valley, the hills of Canaan rise in the distance. The land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is finally within sight. I think it's worth slowing down here because it's easy to read past this moment without appreciating what it must have felt like. Imagine spending your entire life preparing for a destination you've never actually seen. Many of the adults standing in that camp have been born after Israel left Egypt. They had grown up beneath tents instead of permanent roofs. Their childhood memories are filled with wilderness landscapes, manna appearing each morning, the tabernacle standing at the center of the camp, and the constant hope that one day they would inherit a land their parents spoke about but had never possessed. For them, the Promised Land wasn't simply a place on a map. It represented the fulfillment of a promise that had shaped their entire identity. You can almost imagine the atmosphere throughout the camp. Families would have been talking about the future. Parents who had spent decades raising children in the wilderness were preparing to settle in a permanent homeland. Young adults who had never owned land could finally imagine vineyards, orchards, homes, and communities that wouldn't have to be packed up and moved whenever the cloud lifted from the tabernacle. There must have been excitement, anticipation, hope, and probably a fair amount of anxiety. The wilderness had become familiar. What lay ahead was entirely unknown. That setting makes the previous chapter especially important. King Balak of Moab had watched Israel approach his borders with growing fear. From his perspective, this large nation represented a serious political threat. Instead of attacking immediately, he sought another strategy. He hired a prophet, Balaam, hoping that a curse would weaken Israel before any military conflict could begin. Yet every attempt failed. Again and again, Balaam found himself blessing Israel instead of cursing them. The biblical narrative presents God's covenant blessing as something no foreign king could overturn. Balak could scheme, Balaam could speak, armies could gather, yet Israel remained under the blessing of the God who had brought them out of Egypt. That literary connection is easy to overlook, but I think it's one of the keys to understanding the next chapter. The danger facing Israel doesn't disappear. Instead, it changes. The threat no longer comes from outside the camp. It now emerges from within. I think the biblical author is making a profound observation that still resonates today. Sometimes a people aren't undone by the enemies surrounding them. Sometimes they slowly lose themselves by forgetting who they are. I believe that's the central question running beneath the surface of Numbers 25. Many readers assume the chapter is primarily about sexual immorality because Numbers 25, 1 through 3 begins by describing Israelite men becoming involved with Moabite women. Those relationships certainly matter, but I don't think they're the author's primary concern. The relationships become significant because they lead somewhere else. They become the doorway into another people's worship, another people's festivals, another people's understanding of blessing, and ultimately, another people's covenant. The issue isn't simply who Israel is spending time with. The issue is Israel's identity and who they're becoming. To understand why that mattered so deeply, we have to pause and ask a question that many modern readers never think to ask. What exactly was Israel at this point in history? When most of us picture ancient Israel, we imagine the kingdom of David or Solomon. We picture Jerusalem surrounded by walls, the temple standing in all its glory, royal palaces, organized government, and a nation firmly established in its own land. That's the Israel most people know. But that Israel doesn't exist yet. The Israel camped on the plains of Moab is something more fragile. It has no king. It has no capital city. It has no permanent homeland. It has no standing government capable of holding the nation together. It's a confederation of tribes traveling together throughout the wilderness, carrying with them the memory of their deliverance from Egypt and the hope of a land they still haven't earned. Everything that will later define Israel as a nation still belongs to the future. That raises an important question. If Israel isn't held together by a king, a capital city, or a permanent borders, then what actually makes these 12 tribes one people? Every civilization throughout history has had to answer that question. Some nations found their identity in powerful rulers. Others were united by language, geography, or centuries of shared political history. Israel couldn't rely on any of those things because they didn't yet possess them. Instead, the Bible authors give a remarkably different answer. Israel exists because of its covenant with God. I think covenant is one of those biblical words that deserves to be understood more deeply because its meaning has changed over time. Today, when we hear the word covenant, many of us think of a solemn promise or perhaps the vows exchanged during a wedding ceremony. Those ideas certainly capture part of its meaning, but they don't fully express what covenant meant to the ancient Israelites standing on the plains of Moab. To the Israelites, covenant wasn't simply an agreement they'd made with God. It was the relationship that created the nation itself. The covenant answered the most fundamental question every society ever eventually has to answer. Who are we? Israel believed they were the people who God had delivered from Egypt, sustained in the wilderness, and invited into a unique relationship. Their identity wasn't built primarily upon military strength, political power, or even shared ancestry. It rested upon the conviction that they belonged to the God who had entered into covenant with them. That understanding shaped every part of Israel's life. The covenant didn't simply tell them whom to worship. It revealed who they believed God to be. It shaped the way they understood justice. It influenced the way they cared for the vulnerable. It informed their laws, their festivals, their worship, and even the way they understood their purpose in the world. The covenant wasn't merely one part of Israel's religion. It was the foundation which Israel understood itself to exist. I think we sometimes miss how comprehensive that would have been because we live in a world that separates religion from many parts of our life. That we distinguish politics from worship, economics from theology, family life from political life. The ancient Near East didn't make those distinctions in the same way. A nation's understanding of its God shaped the entire culture. If a people believed their God was just, then justice became part of the nation's identity. If they believed their God protected the weak, then care for the weak became part of their communal life. Worship wasn't simply something that happened during religious ceremonies. It continually reminded people who they were and to whom they belonged. When the Bible authors speak about remaining faithful to the covenant, they're talking about far more than continuing to attend religious services. They're talking about preserving the very relationship that made Israel Israel. That's why I think Numbers 25 isn't primarily about the individual morality. It's about the preservation of a people's identity at the very moment they stand on the threshold of becoming a nation. If covenant formed the foundation of Israel's identity, then another question naturally flows. Where did this idea of covenant come from? Was it something Israel invented, or was it already familiar within the ancient world? This is one of those places where history and archaeology help us understand the Bible more deeply. During the last century, archaeologists uncovered numerous treaty documents from Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Hittite Empire that reveal a political practice common throughout the ancient Near East. These discoveries don't diminish the uniqueness of Israel's faith. Instead, they help us understand the cultural language the biblical authors were using when they described God's relationship with Israel. Most of these political arrangements are known as suzerain-vassal treaties. The terminology may sound technical, but the concept itself is surprisingly straightforward. The suzerain was a powerful king who ruled over a number of smaller kingdoms. Rather than governing each territory directly, he often entered into formal treaties with local rulers. The lesser king, known as the vassal, pledged exclusive loyalty to the greater king. In return, the suzerain promised protection, stability, and continued peace. These weren't casual agreements between equals. They established a relationship that defined who held authority and where loyalty belonged. One of the fascinating things scholars noticed is that these treaties often followed a remarkably consistent pattern. They usually began by reminding the vassal of what the great king had already done on his behalf. Only after establishing that history would the treaty explain the obligations expected of the lesser ruler. Finally, the document would conclude with blessings promised for loyalty and consequences for rebellion. The relationship always came first. The obligations followed naturally from it. Biblical scholars such as George Mendenhall and Meredith Kline have long observed that the covenant at Mount Sinai shares many of these same literary characteristics. Not every scholar agrees on every detail of those comparisons, but there is widespread recognition that Israel's covenant fits comfortably within the political world of the ancient Near East while transforming it in a remarkable way. Instead of an earthly emperor standing at the head of the covenant, the biblical authors present God, the God of Israel, as the true sovereign king. Israel becomes his covenant people, not because they conquered a kingdom or built an empire, but because God first acted on their behalf. You can actually see the pattern at the very beginning of the Ten Commandments. Before Israel receives a single commandment, God says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery," in Exodus 22. Only after reminding Israel what he has already done, does he describe the life They're now called to live. Grace precedes obligation. Relationship comes before responsibility. That order is extremely important because it tells us how the biblical authors understood covenant itself. Once we understand that background, the language of loyalty throughout the Old Testament begins to sound very different. Today, we often think of religion primarily as a matter of personal belief or individual preference. One person belongs to one church, another attends somewhere else. Someone else may decide not to participate in religion at all. Those are largely individual choices. In the ancient world did not divide life that way. Religion shaped public life, political life, family life, economic life, and the national identity all at once. A person's worship wasn't simply a private spiritual practice. It publicly declared where their ultimate loyalty rested. It's also helpful to remember that the ancient Near East wasn't generally debating whether other gods existed. That wasn't the question occupying most people. Neighboring nations assumed that other peoples worshipped other gods. The real question was one of covenant loyalty. Which God had entered into relationship with your people? Which God defined your identity? Which God deserved your exclusive allegiance? Israel's scriptures increasingly move toward uncompromising devotion to the God of Israel, but they do so within a world where every nation understood itself as existing under the care and authority of its own unique divine patron. That historical perspective changes the way we read idolatry. Modern readers often hear the word and think primarily about false religious beliefs. The biblical authors certainly believed other forms of worship were incompatible with Israel's covenant, but their concern reached much deeper than theological disagreement. Worshipping another god represented transferring loyalty to another sovereign. From the perspective of the biblical narrative, that wasn't simply changing religious opinions. It threatened the very relationship that had brought Israel into existence. With that foundation in place, we can begin to understand why the story turns towards the Moabites. The events of Numbers 25 don't occur in some mythical landscape populated by anonymous enemies. They take place within a real historical world occupied by neighboring kingdoms, each possessing its own culture, traditions, political structures, and religious beliefs. Israel isn't preparing to enter an empty land. They're entering a world already filled with civilizations that have existed for centuries. The Moabites occupied the elevated plateau east of the Dead Sea. Their territory stretched across fertile farmland overlooking the Jordan Valley. From Israel's camp on the mountains on the plains of Moab, the Israelites would have been living alongside this neighboring kingdom. They would have seen its settlements, watched its shepherds moving their flocks across the hills, and encountered its merchants and travelers. These weren't distant strangers living beyond the horizon. They were neighbors whose daily lives unfolded only a short distance away. The biblical tradition also remembers the Moabites in a particularly interesting way. According to Genesis 19:30 through 38, the Moabites trace their ancestries to Lot, Abraham's nephew. Whether one approaches that account historically, theologically, or as Israel's own traditional memory, it tells us something significant about how Israel viewed this neighboring people. They weren't portrayed as complete outsiders. They were remembered as distant relatives whose history had taken a different path. That shared ancestry created a relationship that was far more complicated than simply dividing the world into friends and enemies. Like every nation in the ancient Near East, Moab possessed its own understanding of the divine. Their national deity was Chemosh, a god mentioned both in the Bible and in archaeological discoveries. At the same time, the worship of Baal extended throughout much of Canaan and the surrounding regions. Ancient religion wasn't neatly organized into separate systems the way many modern people imagine. Local traditions often overlapped. Different cities honored different manifestations of the same deity. Religion regional shrines developed their own customs and practices. The religious landscape surrounding Israel was remarkably diverse, yet deeply interconnected. One of the most important archaeological discoveries illuminating this world is the Mesha Stele, sometimes called the Moabite stone. Dating into the 9th century BC, this inscription records the achievements of King Mesha of Moab and praises Chemosh for delivering the Moabites from their enemies. Historians value the inscription because it allows us to hear the voice of Moab itself rather than only reading Israel's description of its neighbor. The Mesha Stele reminds us that every nation in the ancient Near East believed its own God was acting in history on behalf of its people. Israel wasn't unique in believing that God guided national events. What made Israel distinctive was the particular story it told about the God who had redeemed them from slavery and entered into covenant with them. I think that historical setting is easy to overlook because we often read the Bible as though Israel existed in isolation. In reality, they lived among cultures that were every bit as convicted of their own traditions as Israel was of hers. The Moabites believed their religious practices sustained their society, just as Israel believed covenant sustained theirs. Every nation possessed its own festivals, its own sacred places, and its own understanding of how the gods governed the world. The question wasn't whether these neighboring cultures existed. The question was whether Israel could live among them without gradually becoming indistinguishable from them. That brings us to one of the most important observations in the entire chapter. Assimilation almost never begins with hostility. It usually begins with familiarity. People meet one another, they trade with one another, they share meals together, they attend one another's celebrations, they marry, they become neighbors and friends. None of those ordinary human experiences are presented as evil in themselves. Yet, from the perspective of the biblical author, those relationships could slowly reshape Israel's identity if they also led to the nation into another people's worship and another people's covenant. I think that's why the author spent so little time describing military conflict and so much time describing relationships. The greatest threat isn't an invading army. It's the gradual transformation of Israel's loyalties. Once we understand that, we finally are ready to return to the opening verses of Numbers 25 and ask what actually happened at Baal-Peor. With that historical background in mind, let's return to the biblical narrative itself. Numbers 25:1 opens with a deceptively simple statement. While Israel remained at Shittim, the people began to commit sexual immorality with the daughters of Moab. At first glance, it appears the chapter is primarily concerned with sexual behavior. Yet, the very next verses immediately broaden the picture. Numbers 25:2-3 tells us that the women invited the Israelites to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate at the sacrificial meals, bowed down before those gods. Israel became joined to Baal at Peor. The biblical author deliberately shifts our attention from the relationships themselves to what those relationships ultimately produced. The relationships become significant because they lead to the participation in another people's worship. I think it's important that we slow down here because this is where modern readers often imagine the story very differently than it may actually have unfolded. It's easy to picture someone openly inviting an Israelite to abandon the God of Israel and worship another deity. Human relationships rarely develop that way. Throughout history, cultures have usually influenced one another through ordinary acts of friendship and hospitality, trade, marriage, and shared celebrations. Those ordinary human experiences become the bridge through which ideas, beliefs, and customs gradually travel from one country to another. Hospitality occupied an especially important place throughout the ancient Near East. Welcoming guests and sharing meals and inviting neighbors into community celebrations were deeply valued social customs Because meals weren't simply opportunities to satisfy hunger, they created trust, they strengthened relationships, they established mutual respect between families and communities. Refusing hospitality could even be considered an insult in some situations. When neighboring peoples gathered together, relationships were often formed around shared meals long before they were formed around shared beliefs. Imagine then what these first encounters may have looked like. The biblical text doesn't describe the conversations, so we shouldn't pretend to know exactly what was said at that time. The historians who have studied ancient Near Eastern societies understand that invitations to communal festivals would have been entirely ordinary. It's not difficult to imagine someone saying, "Come celebrate with us. Come join our feast. Our families will be there." Those invitations wouldn't have necessarily have sounded dangerous to any Israelite standing on the edge of the Promised Land after decades in the wilderness. They may have sounded generous. They may have even sounded like the beginning of a peaceful relationship with their new neighbors. The challenge is that the ancient festivals weren't simply social gatherings. They often divided life into categories that made very little sense in the ancient world. We separate religious life from civic life. We distinguish family celebrations from religious observances. We separate politics and worship and economics from theology. The ancient Near East didn't organize life that way. Agricultural festivals, community celebrations, religious sacrifices, commerce, music and food, family gatherings, and public worship all blended together into one communal experience. To participate in one aspect of the celebration often meant participating in all of it. That explains why Numbers 25 emphasizes that the Israelites ate and bowed down. Those aren't random details. Sharing the sacramental meal and participating in acts of worship represented involvement in the religious life of the community. What may have begun as social participation gradually became covenant participation. From the perspective of the biblical author, Israel wasn't simply enjoying another culture's hospitality. Israel was beginning to identify itself with another source of blessing. This brings us to Baal, one of the most significant deities worshipped throughout Canaan and much of the surrounding region. The word Baal simply means Lord or Master. It wasn't originally the name of one individual deity. As much as it was the title that could be associated with local manifestations of the storm god worshipped throughout the Levant. When the Bible speaks about Baal-Peor, it's most likely referring to Baal associated with Peor, probably a local sanctuary or sacred site connected with Mount Peor. In other words, Peor refers to the place, while Baal-Peor refers to the local manifestation of Baal worship associated with that place. To understand why Baal worship proved so attractive, we need to appreciate the world ancient farmers inhabited. Most of us buy food from grocery stores supplied by enormous agricultural systems stretching across continents. Ancient societies lived much closer to uncertainty. Rain determined whether crops survived. Healthy livestock determined whether families had food, clothing, and economic security. A failed harvest didn't simply mean higher prices. It could mean hunger, disease, or even famine. Survival depended upon forces that seemed completely beyond human control. Within that world, Baal represented hope. The people of Canaan believed Baal governed the storms that brought rain to the land. They believed he blessed crops, livestock, vineyards, orchards, and human fertility. Whether those beliefs reflected reality isn't the historical question we're asking today. The important question is why intelligent people sincerely believed Baal deserved their worship. From their perspective, honoring Baal wasn't irrational. It was an attempt to live in harmony with the forces they believed sustained life itself. I think that's important. It's an important observation because it's easy to dismiss ancient religion as simple superstition. Yet when we place ourselves inside their world, we begin to understand why these beliefs carried such persuasive power. Imagine living in a farming community where every successful harvest is attributed to Baal's blessing. Imagine neighboring families sincerely believing their prosperity came because they faithfully participated in these annual festivals. Whether we agree with those conclusions today isn't really the point. The point is that the claims made sense within the world they inhabited. At this point, it's important to distinguish carefully between the biblical text, what the biblical text tells us, and what historians reconstruct from their evidence. Numbers doesn't describe the rituals associated with Baal-Peor in detail. The text simply says that Israel participated in the sacrifices of the Moabite gods and became joined to Baal of Peor. Archaeology, ancient inscriptions, and comparative studies of Canaanite religion help scholars reconstruct the broader religious environment, but those reconstructions extend beyond the specific details recorded in Numbers itself. I think maintaining that distinction is an important part of responsible historical study. Many scholars believe fertility rituals likely played some role in Baal worship because similar practices are documented elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Other scholars urge greater caution, pointing out that direct evidence specifically connected ritualized sexual practices with Baal-Peor remains limited. While there is broad agreement that fertility stood at the center of Baal's role in the Canaanite religion, historians continue to debate exactly how those beliefs were expressed in different places and different periods. Rather than pretending certainty where evidence remains incomplete, I think it's better to acknowledge both the strengths and the limitations that we know. What the biblical author leaves no doubt about is the theological significance of Israel's actions. Numbers 25:3 says that Israel yoked itself to Baal-Peor. Some English translations say Israel joined itself or attached itself to Baal. However it is translated, the language suggests more than passive curiosity. It describes an ongoing relationship of loyalty and attachment. The concern isn't that someone attended one festival out of curiosity. The concern is that Israel began forming a new allegiance. That language becomes even more meaningful when we remember everything we've learned about covenant. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, worship isn't merely an expression of private belief. Worship publicly declares loyalty. Every sacrifice, every festival, every act of devotion answers the question, to whom do I belong? From the perspective of the biblical author, Israel wasn't experimenting with another religion. Israel was slowly redirecting its covenant loyalty towards another source of blessing. And that's why I think this chapter unfolds so differently than many modern readers expect. Today, when we often separate personal relationships from religious identity. And we usually separate religion from nearly every other part of life. The ancient Israelites didn't think that way. Marriage, family, economics, agriculture, politics, worship, and national identity formed one integrate whole. Participating in one people's religious life meant gradually participating in another people's understanding of reality itself. When viewed from that perspective, the transition from the previous chapter becomes remarkably clear. Balak couldn't destroy Israel through curses because external opposition couldn't overturn the covenant God had established with his people. Now the narrative presents a different possibility. Israel may never be conquered from the outside if it slowly abandons its covenant from within. Whether we approach this passage as history, literature, or theology, the author's message is unmistakable. The greater danger facing Israel isn't another nation's army. It's the slow erosion of Israel's own identity. With that background established, the second half of Numbers 25 begins to unfold with remarkable intensity. After telling us that Israel has joined itself to Baal-Peor, Numbers 25:4-5 describes God instructing Moses to deal with those who had participated in this covenant betrayal while a devastating plague spread throughout the camp. The narrative doesn't stop to explain the mechanics of the plague or attempt to describe it medically. Instead, the Bible author interprets the event theologically. From Israel's perspective, the plague represented the visible consequence of covenant unfaithfulness. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, national disasters are often understood through this theological framework. The biblical writers weren't simply interested in describing what happened. They were trying to understand what those events meant within Israel's relationship with God. That way of thinking can feel unfamiliar to modern readers because we usually distinguish between historical events and theological interpretation. We often ask what caused an event in purely natural terms. Ancient Israel certainly recognized natural events, but they also asked another question that was just as important to them. What did this event mean within the covenant? How did it reveal something about Israel's relationship with God? Whether one accepts that theological explanation today is a separate discussion. The important point is that this is how the biblical author understood the crisis unfolding before him. It is at this point that the narrative reaches a dramatic climax. Numbers 25:6 tells us that while Moses and the entire community were gathered before the entrance of the tent of meeting, weeping over the tragedy that had overtaken the camp, an Israelite man openly brought a Midianite woman into the camp in full view of everyone. The author later identifies them as Zemiri, a leader from the tribe of Simeon, and Cosbi, the daughter of a Midianite clan leader in Numbers 25:14-15. The fact that both individuals were named suggests that the original audience either knew these traditions or understood their significance within Israel's memory. Here again, I think it's important that we resist the temptation to imagine details the text never provides. The narrative doesn't explain Zemiri's motives. It doesn't tell us whether the relationship began as romance, political alliance, or personal defiance. Historians simply don't know. What the author does emphasize is that public nature of his actions. This wasn't something hidden away from the community. According to the narrative, it took place while the nation stood gathered before the sanctuary mourning the crisis that had already engulfed them. From the author's perspective, the timing and visibility of the act mattered every bit as much as the act itself. It is within that setting that Phinehas enters the story. Numbers 25:7-8 tells us that Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, took a spear, entered the tent after the couple, and killed them both. Immediately afterward, the text says the plague ceased, although not before 24,000 people had died, according to Numbers 25:9. There is no denying that this is one of the most disturbing scenes in the entire Torah. It has challenged Jewish interpreters, Christian theologians, historians, and other ordinary readers for centuries. But one of the most difficult aspects of the story is that the biblical author doesn't present Phinehas as a villain. Quite the opposite. In Numbers 25:10-13, God commands Phinehas and he commends Phinehas and establishes what the text calls a covenant of peace with him and his descendants. For many modern readers, that response feels almost impossible to reconcile with their understanding of God's character. Yet, before we reject the passage or attempt to explain it away, I think it's worth asking one more historical question. Why would the biblical author have viewed Phinehas so differently than many of us do? I think the answer takes us back to everything we explored throughout this study. From the perspective of the ancient Israelites, covenant wasn't merely one aspect of national life. It was the foundation of the nation's existence. Throughout the ancient Near East, covenant loyalty carried enormous significance. Political treaties weren't maintained by casual promises. They were preserved by uncompromising allegiance. Rebellion against the covenant wasn't viewed as a private matter because it threatened the stability of the entire community. The biblical author appears to understand Phinehas as someone acting to preserve the covenant at the very moment it seemed to be collapsing. That historical explanation helps us understand the author's reasoning. but I don't think it removes every ethical tension, nor should it. Jewish interpreters have wrestled with this passage for centuries. Christian interpreters have done the same. Some understand Phinehas as acting within a unique historical moment that should never be repeated or generalized into a model for later generations, while others, the account primarily is theological history, explaining how ancient Israel understood its own past rather than prescribing how future generations should behave. Many modern biblical scholars continue to debate the passage, particularly when reading it alongside later biblical themes emphasizing mercy, justice, patience, and reconciliation. I think it's more important to acknowledge those conversations honestly rather than pretending the text presents no difficulty. What I do think we can say with confidence is that Numbers 25 reflects an ancient understanding of covenant that differs significantly from the way people think today. The biblical author isn't primarily asking whether individual people have made poor personal decisions. He's asking whether Israel will remain the people it believes God to create it to be. Every major event in this chapter revolves around that central question or concern. The relationships, the sacrificial meals, the worship of Baal-Peor, the plague, and the actions of Phinehas are all understood through the question of covenant identity. Seen from that perspective, the chapter takes on a very different shape. It becomes less a story about isolated moral failures and more a story about survival of a nation standing at one of the most vulnerable moments in its history. Israel possesses no king, no permanent capital, and no homeland of its own. The covenant is the one reality holding its tribes together. If that covenant dissolves, then from the perspective of the biblical author, Israel itself begins to dissolve. I think that's ultimately the world Numbers 25 invites us to enter. It doesn't ask us to stop asking difficult questions, nor does it require us to abandon our own moral reflections. Instead, it invites us to first to understand the people who preserved this story. They believed their covenant with God defined their identity, shaped their community, and secured their future. Once we understand that worldview, the intensity of the chapter begins to make historical sense, even if some of its ethical questions remain unresolved. One of the things I appreciate most about studying the Bible this way is that archaeology, history, linguistics, and careful scholarship don't diminish the biblical text. They illuminate it. Learning about suzerain-vassal treaties helps us understand covenant language. Studying the history of Moab helps us understand Israel's neighbors. Discoveries like Mesha Stele remind us that these were real kingdoms living within a real historical world. Examining the worship of Baal also helps us understand why those religious practices appeared persuasive to the people who embraced them. None of these principles replace Scripture. Instead, they help us hear Scripture more nearly the way the first audience would have heard it. As we finish this chapter, I'd like to return to the question we asked at the very beginning. Why was God's response so severe? I don't think we've answered every question, and I don't think we've removed every difficulty. I still understand why this chapter troubles many thoughtful readers. My hope isn't that we've made the passage comfortable. My hope is that we've made it understandable. Historical understanding doesn't require agreement. It asks us first to enter the world of the text before evaluating it through the assumptions of our own world. I think that's one of the great gifts of studying the Bible historically. It reminds us that these writings emerged from real people living in a very different culture than ours. They asked different questions. They understood community differently. They thought about covenant, worship, identity, and national survival in ways that often challenge our modern assumptions. The more patiently we listen to their world before speaking from ours, the more deeply we begin to understand why these ancient writings have continued to shape the human history for thousands of years. Well, thank you for joining me in this deep dive through Numbers chapter 25. I hope our time together has helped you see this difficult passage with fresh eyes and given you a greater appreciation for the historical world behind the biblical text. I always enjoy taking these journeys with you, and I hope you'll continue exploring these ancient stories alongside me as we work our way through the scriptures, one chapter at a time. Peace and love be with you, and we'll see you in the next chapter soon.